even if it's encrypting as much as it kind of uncovers.
Yeah, I do think though that when some people read the book, there was a real tendency to uncode it, which is ironic considering that it's really a book about code. Yeah. But it's also it's an interesting thing that you've really smuggled all this in a very traditional novelistic structure. I mean, as I was saying to you earlier, it reminds you even. I mean, certainly not an avant-garde novel. It's very far from the anti-novel tradition that I think Remainder engages.
Yeah.
But there's something about it that even partakes of what seemed to be very much an 18th century episodic novel.
The kind of mainframe rhetorical mode for it is a 19th century Bildungsroman. Stuff happens in a linear fashion and it carries on until he's dead and then it's over. I mean, it's kind of, it's quite, I mean, whatever, Dickens, I mean, I like that stuff too. I mean, in a way I wanted, it seems to me that everything is we're talking about this today, some of my students from Columbia here. Hi, we're talking about this whole idea of realism and the notion that it's any more real than something else is kind of faulty. I mean, it's a literary convention and therefore as fraught with artifice as any other literary convention. I think once you realize that, it's quite liberating because everything is just, it's almost like software available for you to use and reconfigure, and I don't feel the need to kind of reject narrative or to reject, that kind of realist mode. I think it can run, as it were, I keep using this computer language, but it can kind of run alongside a tradition that's come more through like Kurt Schwitter's and William Burroughs and this much more blatantly avant-garde thing. They don't have to be totally contradictory. One can kind of work in the shell of the other. It was also strategic as well. I mean, when I started writing this, I hadn't managed to get any novel published, and so there was the sense that using a kind of 19th century shell would be a bit like a Trojan horse.
Yeah.
To get it past, the publishing industry. I mean, there was, by the time I'd finished it, Remainder had come out and things had changed. But there was that kind of aspect to it as well, camouflage almost.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the things that's nice though is that there could have been the impulse, and it would have been a very different novel, but to use the Trojan horse to smuggle it in, but then to eviscerate the horse in the process, and that doesn't really happen so much it's a fairly, structure of it is very strong. I mean, it has a very strong architecture, and you really feel like despite the fact that it's certainly not a traditional protagonist, and it's not a psychological novel, but you do feel like there's that undergirds it throughout.
I think there are lots of precedents for Serge, though. I mean, in his Melancholia, that goes all the way back through Hamlet. He's a kind of Antigone figure as well, obsessed with crypts and with this kind of repetition, reenactment of burial rites. And in his blankness, I mean, Slothrop in Gravity's Rainbow, even like Candide. I think there's a whole tradition of protagonists who are almost like prisms to capture and reflect the light around them, rather than exuding the light as a point of origin. They're the kind of sounding board for other stuff.
Yeah, well, he has an absolute blankness.
I don't think he's that much of a kind of, anti-type of a kind of protagonist, really. I think it's quite a traditional aspect of that as well.
How did you, I mean, this is a question that goes to how you kind of put together a book like this. I mean, did you set out with a really strong sense of the structure of the book, or was it something that I mean, we were talking earlier about it. There's a tremendous amount of very deep reading that went into thinking the book through. Did you do a lot of research and then sit down to write, or were they in some kind of dialectical relationship to each other?
No, I had the idea. I was doing this art project at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, which involved setting up a radio station. It was almost like it was a kind of tribute or a reenactment of these scenes in Jean Cocteau's Orphée, where you have this dead poet transmitting over the radio, and so the technology and death are kind of tied in with each other. And I was getting all these people to strip lines from the media and remix them and retransmit them out into London. Again, a very kind of Burroughs thing. And I was just doing a lot of research about the history of telecommunications and radio, and just all these dead siblings kept cropping up. Every time, Bell, 2 dead brothers, and then he invents the phone. In fact, after the first brother died, the two surviving ones said, if another of us should die, let's agree that the survivor will invent a technological device capable of communicating with the dead. And then the other brother did die, and the telephone's invented. And Bell never believed in an afterlife because his brother never called, right? I mean,
he probably would have invented it anyway. I think you've said that.
Yeah, he probably would have invented it anyway. But this kind of desire is vested. It's in the technology from the off. So anyhow, this kind of relationship between technology and mourning, and then I was looking at Nabokov, at Ardo, which is all about telecommunications and dead siblings and incest and all this kind of stuff. And there was all this Egyptian imagery in it early on. You know, family trunks are described as being like sarcophagi. So I started looking at Carter and Carnarvon. Also, there are dead siblings there, insects, you know.
There was a strong etymological
family. There's a strong etymological thing
interest.
in Carter's background, and then you know the family crypt, Tutankhamun, and then you know radio. 1922 is the year it's dug up, the year that Ulysses is written, and the BBC is founded, and The Wasteland is published. This giant radio poem with voices coming in and out, and Britain is setting up the Empire wireless chain in Egypt right there. These pylons going across Egypt to transmit its empire, and at that minute it loses Egypt, right? So even as a political level, this radio is a kind of, the technology is a kind of crypt or something. Oh, I know, all these things just came together, and I just suddenly had the idea, here's a novel.
Yeah, but it's, and then when you obviously did a tremendous amount of historical research on World War I, while you're writing it as well. I mean, I think that's one of the sections of the book that's by far, it's incredibly moving. And the book flashes back and forth between feeling like it was something that was written as a historical novel versus something that could have been written by Gertrude Stein.
Well, that's the weird thing with with World War I. I sat in the Imperial War Museum reading room, which is great. It's right up in the dome, and I'm amazed they let you handle these. They're giving you the actual documents of pilots' logs that are crumbling in your hands, and they call them narratives, the flight narrative. They have to give a narrative when they come back from this flight. It's kind of beautiful. But simultaneously, I was reading all about stuff like, the radio guy on the plane faces backwards over this mayhem. It's exactly what Pastor Benjamin says about the angel of history, facing backwards over the carnage, and yet, it's kind of all true. This is not some poetic proposition. It's actually what happened. And then I was kind of simultaneously reading Marinetti and all the futurists who, it's deeply problematic stuff, but they write absolutely beautifully about the kind of dynamism of flight and technology and death and geometry and all this kind of World War I. Well, they were all in World War I as well, and it just kind of all meshed. So, on one hand, a quite conservatively researched, historically accurate thing seemed to be meshing with a totally avant-garde, tradition seamlessly. Which is not. I'm not taking any credit for that. This is the way things work.
Yeah. How did you get so interested in Marinetti?
Marinetti's great. You gotta love him. It really is. It's very exhilarating stuff. He just writes amazing, and he's another figure like Heidegger. Politically inexcusable and dreadful, but is so influential. As people like Derrida and Levinas, both of them Jewish, say, they would not have written a word without Heidegger. And I think lots of the avant-garde, which tends to go down, to be on the left, owes so much to Marinetti. He was on the far right. This whole kind of overthrow of an older kind of quasi-religious, sentimental order of aesthetics and a kind of celebration of the of the implications of technology for art and for literature. Writers like, I think he really kind of puts his finger on what's going on in the work of writers who wouldn't necessarily have been his followers, like Kafka. The huge role of technology in Kafka, elevators and writing machines and so on.
We were talking the other night about the closeness of, not just in the penal colony, obviously, but America originally.
Yeah, the lift the elevator is a sacred thing. To know the mechanism behind the mechanism is just like, it's priestly, it's kind of epiphanic. So the bellboys, the elevator boys are like priests with this magnificent kind of machine, which is always a kind of metaphor for writing in Kafka. But Marinetti really kind of articulates it. He never, you know, when he sits down to write a novel, it's kind of not very good. But when he writes his manifestos about how the novel could be, they're absolutely exhilarating and very funny as well. I mean, there's a whole. You could almost reclaim it for the left by saying this is so ridiculous, it's such a parody. You know, we love war, let us plunge forward and die and splatter our brains across the machine parts. And I mean, it's like Ballard writing in Crash.
Yeah.
You know? There's a kind of satirical aspect to it as well. But you know, as an artist, he's pure pathology. I guess you could say the same about someone like Warhol. I mean, the role of the artist then is not necessarily to analyse the situation. I mean, that's the role of the critic. The role of the artist is almost to become that. Do you know what I mean? I mean, to be the patient, the psychic.
The transmitter, I think, was
the transmitter, yeah. And so Marinetti, you know, I was reading Marinetti, then I was reading Virilio, and Virilio is like the safe, sanitized version of Marinetti, you know, and he's saying it in a safe way, you know, let us consider the role of the aeroplane or the bunker. But Marinetti is just kind of going, you know, I want to fuck this plane, it's beautiful, you know, the bunker is my womb, and it's so much more, you know, Virilio seems like a kind of footbath after the ocean, you know, of Marinetti.
Well, in the World War I section, all the sex scenes either involve, for you, either involve reading Holderlin or a plane crash when, actually he's not ejaculating during the plane crash, but...
He's reading Holderlin and shooting up heroin and you know, ejaculating off the back of the plane into the trenches. It's sort of kind of reprise of the needle groove thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so no, this complete meshing of geometry and sex and
war, what is it good for?
Yeah, right, it's good for him, definitely. No, he loves the war. I mean, the war is a kind of, the war is a, the way C works is there's no progress, there's only repetition in a way. So the war kind of repeats in a global kind of political way or a pan-European political way what was already going on in the family situation. You know, this, I read this really good critic, Lawrence Rickels, that says that war is a shutdown of corpse disposal, right? It's the return of the bodies. It's the failure of mourning, the failure of burial. You know, it's about being haunted by the dead. There are literally dead all around you. And so for Serge, the war is just a kind of literalization of the psychic state he's already living. And in a way, for that reason, he loves it. You know, he really likes the war.
It seems like it would, yeah, it definitely, it's probably the most animated that he is in the entire book.
Yeah,
I think.
And up in the plane as well, you know, he feels, you know, he's sending signals. Everything becomes geometry. The vapor trails, the kind of the gridding of the land. He's in pure geometry, and he feels like he's been elevated to a higher point within the order of things. This kind of, again, kind of priestly point from which all the vectors and control lines and the very language of the sacred invocations has kind of been revealed to him. It's under his finger. Because also in World War I, there's lots of writing on the ground. There's huge letters appearing over the ground to show you where to fly and stuff. So he's kind of flying through the alphabet. I guess that gets reprised in Alexandria towards the end, where geometry comes from, and the streets are named after the alphabet. It's kind of moving through language, or in all the radio bits. So that's what I mean. It's just all the same. Escalations of the same thing again and again.
Yeah. Serge is in many ways, I mean, you can call him a failed artist or a successful artist. We know at one point that he studies architecture and he more or less can't do perspective, which is kind of a funny aspect to see. And the unnamed protagonist in Remainder is also accused at many different points of being a performance artist.
Yeah.
Your background, you've intersected with the art world. In fact, I would say that the Remainder was really written under the sign of the art world much more than the literary world.
Sign of the art world, definitely.
It was originally published by Small Art Press in Paris.
As a conceptual art project. They made it look like the Olympia Press books from the 60s. I mean, the font, the cover. For them, it was a conceptual art piece to publish books. It was a reenactment.
How large was the press?
Oh, it's tiny. It was like 1,000. It's 750 copies. I mean, it's tiny.
And that was 2005?
Yeah.
And before that, you had shopped the novel around for a number of years.
Oh yeah, no, nobody would touch it.
Well, how did it come about that it became such a I don't call it an overnight success, because obviously it's not. It took you a very long time. But once it was published, it did. The jump was made fairly quickly from the.
It just started getting all this press, and I mean, kind of straight away, and then Marty Asher, the head of Vintage here, picked it up, said, oh, to this beautiful vintage edition, which is this lovely blue cover. And then, of course, all the British ones, as soon as they read that in the press, they wanted to do it. I was kind of too pissed off with them.
Oh, that's funny. It ricocheted from the US back to the UK.
Yeah. So
okay, I hadn't
there
realized
was a
that.
good independence in the UK with it. But no, there was quite a quick. But it's strange. I mean, I felt like people in the art world seemed to get it straight away because, I mean, Remained is very much about reenactment and repetition, which is a huge kind of. A huge whatever modal logic in the art world. There's all these people whose work consists of reenactment, but also I find they tend to be more literate than most people in the books world.
Well, that's interesting. That's something we were talking about the other night.
Most artists have they've read Beckett and they've read Faulkner and they've read Joyce and stuff. You find someone in. I mean, the people I'm working with in publishing now are fantastic and are literate, but I find. Often they're kind of the exception. Lots of people in the publishing industry just don't read that stuff, and you kind of.
There's a real, I mean, not only for high modernist texts, but also for a lot of what gets called theory. It still has a real kind of minatory sense about it. I think for a lot of people, and maybe there's some kind of return of the repressed that's that accounts in some ways for the success of C. You can also see it though now. So much of Late Willem Bark has just recently been republished with some fairly interesting introductory essays, new introductory essays. But there's definitely a sense within the world of people who want to become writers that it's not the route that they take to immerse themselves in these texts. In fact, I don't think that I think there's a real kind of sense of allergy to many of the books that you're most interested in, but for some reason that hasn't been the case with in the art world. I mean, I think there's a sense that at least in art schools, people pretend like they've read these texts if they haven't in fact. So there.